Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into the story of Cicely Davis today. Someone who's definitely stirred things up a bit.
Hmm.
Some are calling her a visionary leader.
Right.
Others see her more as a political opportunist.
Yeah, classic dilemma, isn't it? Especially in today's world.
We've got a ton of articles, interviews, background info, and we're going to help you figure out, is Davis really about making a difference or just playing the political game?
A bit of a grifter or gifted situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, for anyone who might not know her, Cicely Davis is a Republican,
Right.
ran against Ilhan Omar
Familiar name.
in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District back in 2022.
Okay.
Her background is pretty interesting. Raised by a single parent in Rochester, New York,
Okay.
later moved to Minnesota,
Right.
and has been super involved in community work.
That community work, that's a key part of her story, I think.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Especially her time as the state director of BLEX Minnesota,
Right.
an organization all about empowering Black communities.
And they advocate for some pretty big things.
They do school choice entrepreneurship,
Criminal justice reform,
big issues.
things that really resonate with a lot of voters,
They do, for sure.
regardless of their political leanings.
Absolutely.
And she's very open about how her political views have changed over time.
Right.
She's talked about feeling this disconnect
Interesting.
between her Christian values and where she saw the Democratic Party going.
Then it happens.
And that ultimately led her to embrace conservatism.
Makes sense.
Yeah, she was very vocal about this at a walkaway town hall event,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
especially her statement about how she sees the Republican Party as the one that truly cares about Black communities.
Now, that definitely ruffled some feathers.
It did. It kind of flipped the script on those traditional political alignments.
For sure, it challenges those deep-seated assumptions about which party truly represents the interests of marginalized groups.
And that's something we'll definitely be digging deeper into later.
Looking forward to it.
But for now, let's get into the specifics of her 2022 campaign.
Okay, so we're going from the big picture to the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. And one thing that really stood out to me was how this campaign went beyond just local politics.
It did, didn't it? It attracted attention from all over the country.
Like, became a national stage for these competing visions of America's future.
You hit the nail on the head there.
Almost like she became a symbol for a certain segment of the population.
For sure, those folks who felt disillusioned with what they saw as the radical left.
Yeah, actually.
And, all that national attention, it translated into some pretty impressive fundraising numbers for Davis.
Yeah, didn't it? I remember reading about that.
She raised almost $37,000 in a single quarter.
Wow. That's a lot of money for a newcomer.
It is, especially when you're challenging a well-established incumbent.
So money clearly wasn't an obstacle for her campaign.
On its all.
But what did she actually stand for? What were those key messages that she was trying to get across?
Right, what was she actually saying?
And how did they land with voters? Did they resonate or fall flat?
Good question.
Well, we know from her campaign website
Okay.
that she focused heavily on two main themes:
Two big buckets.
public safety and the cost of living.
Smart choices. Those are issues that touch everyone's lives.
Regardless of political affiliation.
Absolutely bread and butter issues, you might say.
Exactly. So on public safety, Davis was all about rebuilding the police force
Law and order, a classic theme.
and implementing what she called common sense solutions to fight crime.
Practical, straightforward, appealing to those who feel like things have gotten out of control.
And she even got an endorsement from the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association.
Wow, that's a big deal. It shows she had some serious credibility with law enforcement.
So she was really positioning herself as the candidate who would bring back order and security,
Makes sense appealing to those who are feeling vulnerable.
especially in a time when it felt like things were so unsettled.
Definitely playing into that sense of unease.
Now, on the cost of living.
Okay, the other big one.
She was super vocal about her concerns about rising inflation
Another issue that hits everyone's wallets.
and how it was impacting individuals and small businesses.
Especially those who are already struggling to make ends meet.
Right. She was really painting herself as a champion for those folks.
Someone who understood their struggles.
And she was pretty critical of what she saw as ineffective economic policies from the other side.
So she was offering herself as the alternative, the solution to their economic anxieties.
It's interesting how she framed these issues,
Yeah.
really tapping into that emotional core of what people were experiencing at the time.
Connecting with people where it matters, making it personal.
But of course, a campaign isn't just about putting forward your own vision.
Sure.
It's also about setting yourself apart from your opponent.
Drawing those contrasts.
And in this case, her opponent was a pretty high-profile figure.
Ilhan Omar, not someone who shies away from the spotlight.
And Davis was very direct in her criticisms of Omar.
She didn't hold back.
She accused Omar of being more focused on self-promotion and celebrity than on actually serving the needs of her constituents.
Now, that's a pretty bold accusation.
It is. Did she give any specific examples to back that up?
Well, she pointed to a few key areas where she really disagreed with Omar's policies and actions,
Like what?
particularly on defunding the police and Omar's record on Israel.
Two very hot-button issues.
They are, for sure, the kind of things that get people fired up.
And Davis definitely used them strategically to paint a picture of Omar as being out of touch with her district.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So, for example, on the defunding the police issue,
Okay.
Davis claimed that it had led to a surge in crime in Minneapolis.
Using that as evidence of Omar's failed leadership.
Exactly. Contrasting that with her own approach.
Emphasizing her support for law enforcement and that endorsement from the police association.
So she was tapping into those fears about rising crime rates.
And linking those fears to Omar's policies.
It's classic tactic, isn't it? Present yourself as that strong, decisive leader who will restore order.
While your opponent is portrayed as weak or reckless. But it's important to remember that the defund the police movement is super complex.
It is.
And there are a lot of different views on what its impact has actually been.
Right.
It's crucial for people to do their own research.
To go beyond the sound bites.
And not just take those claims at face value.
Absolutely look into the actual crime statistics in Minneapolis.
Exactly. See what the data says.
And then draw your own conclusions.
Don't let anyone tell you what to think.
You mentioned Israel as another point of contention.
Yeah, that was a big one.
What was Davis's stance on that issue?
Well, Davis presented herself as a strong supporter of Israel.
Okay.
And she contrasted that with Omar's more critical stance.
So another clear dividing line between them.
Exactly. She specifically called out Omar's vote against funding the Iron Dome defense system.
Remember that?
Which caused a lot of controversy.
It did accusations of antisemitism and everything.
A very charged issue.
Davis argued that the alliance between the U.S. and Israel is vital for both countries.
A strategic partnership.
And she emphasized her commitment to making that relationship even stronger.
So aligning herself with a more traditional pro-Israel stance.
Right, and further highlighting that difference between her and Omar.
And she was very vocal about it. She condemned the BDS movement.
The movement calling for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel.
Right, a controversial movement, for sure.
And she didn't mince words. She called it antisemitism and demonization, disguised as human rights advocacy.
Strong words, a clear indication of where she stands on that issue.
It really shows how strongly she feels about these things.
And her willingness to take a firm stance on these really complex and controversial issues.
So beyond these specific policies, how did she frame her overall approach to leadership?
All right, what kind of leader was she trying to project herself as?
What image was she trying to create?
Well, she emphasized her ability to bring stability and unity to a district that she saw as fractured and divided under Omar's leadership.
So presenting herself as the antidote to Omar's perceived recklessness and divisiveness.
Exactly. Promising a more measured and pragmatic approach to governing.
Appealing to that desire for order and predictability.
In a political landscape that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
It's a compelling narrative, especially for those who are already feeling disillusioned with the status quo.
It is. It taps into that deep yearning for something different, something better.
But before we jump to any conclusions,
right, we need all the pieces of the puzzle.
We need to take a closer look at one more piece of the puzzle.
Her finances.
The money trail, always an interesting angle.
There's been some buzz about her campaign fundraising.
Yeah, people want to know who's backing her and why.
And we'll dive into that right after this.
So you want to know who was bankrolling Davis's campaign?
Right. And what were their motives?
It's a natural question, especially when you see a challenger raise that much money.
Especially against an incumbent with national recognition.
Like Omar.
Makes you wonder if there were some powerful forces trying to sway things.
Definitely something to think about.
So do we have any insights into who her donors were? We don't have a full breakdown, but one thing's clear. Her support wasn't just from Minnesota.
Interesting.
She got contributions from individuals and groups all over the country.
Wow.
Shows this race was seen as a bigger battleground.
Right, like a proxy war for these different visions of America.
Exactly. Davis was a champion for conservative values, for some.
Someone who could push back against that rising tide of progressivism.
That's how some saw it.
Her message about law and order, traditional family values, pushing back against woke ideology
Yeah,
really struck a chord with folks who felt like their voices weren't being heard.
like they were being silenced.
Exactly. So it's fascinating how these national narratives seep into local races
They do.
and influence how people vote.
They really do shape the whole landscape.
But what about the folks in her district? How'd they respond to her message?
Well, it was a mixed bag, as you might expect.
Makes sense.
She definitely energized a lot of Republican voters.
Especially those who were already critical of Omar.
Right. They saw Davis as a fresh face, someone who got their concerns.
Someone who shared their values.
Yeah, and she spoke directly to their worries about crime, immigration, the economy.
She presented herself as a strong leader.
Someone who would fight for them in Washington.
But I'm guessing there was some pushback, too.
Oh, absolutely. Not everyone was buying what she was selling.
Right.
Some folks found her rhetoric divisive, even fear-mongering.
Yeah.
They accused her of exploiting those racial and social tensions for political gain.
They felt like she was playing on those existing fears instead of offering real solutions.
Yeah, they pointed to her statements about crime and immigration.
Saying she was relying on harmful stereotypes and prejudices?
Exactly. So it comes down to that age-old question.
Is she sincere or is she just manipulating voters?
Is she truly trying to solve these problems or just using them to stir up emotions?
Tough call.
It really comes down to interpretation.
Some see genuine concern, others see a calculated ploy.
It's like a Rorschach test,
People see what they want to see.
projecting their own beliefs and biases.
Makes it hard to separate genuine leadership from self-interest.
Especially in today's world with social media and misinformation running rampant.
It's a minefield out there.
Okay.
So let's bring it back to Cicely Davis.
Okay.
We've covered her fundraising campaign themes, the reactions she got.
Right.
But what about election night? Did she manage to unseat Omar?
Well, despite the money, the passionate supporters, the critiques of Omar,
She came up short.
she did.
Omar kept her seat.
She did.
What was the margin?
Omar won with a comfortable lead.
Okay.
Over 60% of the vote to Davis's roughly 36%.
So despite all the buzz around her campaign, it didn't translate into a win.
It's a reminder that money and media attention aren't always enough,
There are other factors at play.
like demographics and incumbency.
Omar had a strong base of support in her district.
A district that historically leans Democratic.
So Davis was facing an uphill battle from the start.
Even with all the resources she had.
But even though she lost the election, it seems like her story isn't over. What's she been up to since then? Has she faded away or is she still active?
Oh, she hasn't disappeared.
Okay.
In fact, she's still making her voice heard
How so?
through her podcast, The Savage Truth with Cicely Davis.
A podcast, huh? So she's found another platform to stay engaged.
She has.
What's the focus of her podcast? Is it the same stuff as her campaign?
It's described as riveting current events coverage and a wholehearted rejection of woke ideology.
Sounds about right.
It's a project of Front Page Magazine and the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
Both known for their conservative viewpoints.
Definitely.
So she's leaning into that conservative niche.
She is providing commentary and analysis that aligns with her worldview.
And it seems to be working for her.
It is. She's built a following among those who share her concerns.
Those who appreciate her bold style.
It's fascinating how these alternative media platforms have given people like her a way to build their own audience.
To bypass those traditional gatekeepers.
And in a way, she might have a bigger impact through her podcast than she could have in elected office.
It makes you wonder if winning elections is the only way to be successful in politics these days.
It does. In today's media landscape, you can build influence and shape narratives without holding an official position.
The lines are blurring between politics, media, and entertainment.
They are.
And people like Cicely Davis are navigating that in some interesting ways.
They are. It's a trend that's likely to continue.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Cicely Davis,
Yeah.
what's your final assessment? Visionary leader, savvy opportunist, or somewhere in between?
Well, as we've seen, she's complex.
Definitely.
She's smart, articulate, driven.
And she's tapped into a real sense of frustration and anxiety among certain groups. She's given a voice to those who feel ignored by the mainstream.
That's true.
But is she truly fighting for them, or just using them?
That's the question that keeps coming up.
It's a tough one.
It is, and it's one that each listener has to answer for themselves.
We've tried to be balanced to show her strengths and weaknesses.
To present the whole picture.
But the final judgment is up to each individual. So if someone asked you, is Cicely Davis a grifter or gifted? What would you say?
I'd say she's hard to label.
She doesn't fit neatly into a box.
She's intelligent, ambitious, a skilled communicator.
Whether you love her or hate her, you can't deny she's a force.
It's for sure.
She gets people talking.
Both good and bad.
And that in itself is a kind of effectiveness.
It is. She's not someone who blends in.
She makes you pay attention.
And that's maybe the biggest takeaway from all this.
In a world obsessed with attention, she's figured out how to stand out.
She has.
Is she using that attention to elevate the conversation or divide us further?
Another question for each of us to consider.
It's a reflection of our times. This intense polarization where truth and lies, sincerity and manipulation all get mixed up.
It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
So we have to be careful
We do.
to think critically and question everything.
Especially the motives of those trying to influence us.
And as we navigate this messy world, it's worth remembering that everyone has a story.
A journey that shaped their views.
Sometimes those stories are inspiring,
Sometimes they're troubling.
but they always deserve a closer look.
That's why we do these deep dives.
To peel back the layers, understand the nuances.
And hopefully come away with a better understanding of it all.
So on that note, we wrap up our exploration of Cicely Davis.
Thanks for joining us.
Hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
And maybe even a little bit uncomfortable.
And remember, in a world where charisma and controversy go hand in hand,
It's up to each of us to figure out what's real and what's not.
stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Into the life and legacy of a polarizing figure. We've really dug deep into Cicely Davis's world, haven't we?
We have. From her community work to that political shift.
Through that congressional campaign, and now her role as a media commentator.
Yeah, she's definitely someone who gets people talking.
And that brings us back to that big question.
The one we've been dancing around this whole time.
Is Cicely Davis a visionary leader who's truly trying to make a difference?
Or is she more of a savvy political opportunist?
Is she about helping others, or is she more focused on personal gain?
$1 million question.
And I think we've seen evidence to support both sides.
We have, haven't we?
On one hand, she's deeply involved in community work,
Right.
pushing for school choice criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
She speaks with a lot of passion about her faith.
And her belief that conservative values are the best way forward for Black communities.
And she's clearly resonated with a lot of people,
She has.
especially those who feel kind of alienated by what they see as the woke left. Her fundraising success shows she knows how to connect with people.
And inspire them to get behind her.
But then there are those who question her motives.
Right. Some who see her as exploiting those divisions for her own benefit.
They point to her rhetoric on things like crime and immigration,
Yeah.
saying she's using fear and prejudice instead of offering real solutions.
They question whether her embrace of conservative politics is genuine.
Or just a calculated move to boost her career.
A tough call.
It is ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
We've tried to show both sides of the coin.
Her strengths,
Her weaknesses.
the inspiring parts and the concerning parts.
But in the end, it's your call.
So if someone asked you straight up, is Cicely Davis a grifter or gifted, what would you say?
That's a tough one.
It is, isn't it?
I think I'd say she's too complex for easy labels.
She doesn't fit neatly into any box.
She's intelligent, ambitious, and she's a really skilled communicator.
Love her or hate her, she's a force to be reckoned with.
That's for sure. She definitely makes you pay attention.
That she does. And maybe that's the most important lesson here.
In a world obsessed with attention, she's mastered the art of standing out.
She's found a way to make her voice heard.
But is she using that voice to bring people together or drive them further apart?
Another question to ponder.
It's a reflection of the times we live in, right?
This intense polarization, where it's harder and harder to tell what's true and what's not. Sincerity gets mixed up with manipulation.
It's exhausting.
It is. So we have to be careful
More careful than ever.
to think for ourselves and question everything.
Especially the motives of those who are trying to win us over.
And as we try to make sense of it all,
It's good to remember that everyone has a story.
a journey that's led them to where they are today.
Their worldview, their choices, it all comes from somewhere.
Sometimes those stories inspire us,
Sometimes they make us uncomfortable.
but they always deserve a closer look.
That's what these deep dives are all about.
Peeling back the layers, understanding the nuances.
And hopefully coming out of it with a bit more wisdom.
So that's our exploration of Cicely Davis.
Thanks for joining us.
Hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit challenging.
In a world where charisma and controversy are so intertwined,
The responsibility for figuring out what's real falls on each of us.
you can't just take things at face value.
Stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking those tough questions.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Into the life and legacy of someone who's making waves and dividing opinions.